By 455, the Anglo Saxons and their settlements on mainland Britain were crushed. Vortimer and the Britons had secured Britania for the Celtic and Latin speakers after defeating the Germanic invaders in a series of 4 battles. Both Britons and Germans suffered greatly, and their respective leaders both lost a brother in the battles. The Jute brother, Hengist, was close to securing a large territory for his people in an endeavor with his brother Horsa, but ultimately Horsa died in the 3rd battle, and Hengist fled back to Thanet with the surviving warriors, ships, and settlers. The island of Thanet was now their last refuge. The land in Britania that was to be their salvation was now littered with their dead. For all their misfortunes, the Germanic tribes still had their island refuge. By now, Thanet would have been home to not only Jutes like Hengist, but also Angles and Saxons more inner to the continent. It was primarily these tribes that had swelled Thanet into a moderately sized Germanic colony, although I believe Frisians and Franks already in the proximity joined their fellow Germanic speakers. These were all hardy people who were familiar with survival and death intimately. Their recent losses, although shocking, were not fatal. Additional ships still poured onto the colony despite the threat from Vortimer and his Britons. It was now time for the Britons to suffer great misfortune. Vortimer, the young man who had just prevented their destruction, died. Some chroniclers say Ravenna poisoned him. I would not, however, be surprised to learn that the 4 back-to-back pitched battles may have influenced his health. This was a time where leaders did not cower from the first line of the shield wall, and unfortunately for the Britons, death often has a preference for heroes. Vortimer had saved his people, and now he gracefully exited the story. Our hero is replaced by a villain. The deposed tyrant Vortigern picked up the British crown again. As king, he once more opened up negotiations with the Saxons. Hengist proposed that both people put down the sword and a friendly feast be held between unarmed Briton and German. Vortigern agreed. Both sides met unarmed. Ale, mead, and wine flowed freely among the partygoers. Eventually, the feast was interrupted by Hengist shouting the words, "Nemet oida Saxa," loud enough for all of the partygoers to hear. The Britons did not understand Hengist because he was yelling in an old Germanic tongue, but the Germans did. They carefully took off shoes and articles of clothing to reveal long knives. Then they started stabbing until the only Briton left alive was the king of the Britons. In exchange for his life, Vortigern agreed to give the Germanic settlers Essex, Sussex, and Middlesex, among other districts. The events I just recounted come from the combined accounts of Nennius, Gildas, Bede, and the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, among others. Although their works sometimes conflict and mythological legends have attached themselves over time, they do tell a very real story. By the year 500, where huge cities of Celtic and Latin speakers towered on the eastern and southern districts of Britania, now Germanic communities dotted the landscape. Archaeology corroborates the story, with Anglo-Saxon grave sites gradually spreading from the coasts inward. Britania was slowly transforming into England. The Germans met no meaningful resistance until their invasions reached the opposite shores of the island. Compared to the welcoming shores and fertile valleys of eastern Britania, the western half of the island is not as welcoming. The jagged coasts almost instantly give way to dense and steep mountains which are littered with river crossings besides. Similarly cumbersome in its own way, the geography around Roman Bath was sunken with marshes and wetlands impacted hourly by the ebb and flow of the tide. It's true that the Saxons wanted even this last final real estate of the Romano Britons. The Germanic invaders went as far as the Atlantic Ocean, dipping their red tongues in the western shores. On their way to finish off the remaining Britons, they stumbled onto a character that they helped create. On a hill near the marshlands of Badon, the last Roman of Britania had planted his banner. Gildas tells us his parents had been adorned with the Roman purple before being killed in the invasion of Britania, and his character and actions were recognized as worthy of the Roman purple by his contemporaries. The surviving Britons rallied to his banner. By now, they were beyond weak and desperate. We are told that they were unlikely to defeat the Saxons despite the necessity for it. Since they had been pushed to the extreme edge of their domain, they had lost most of their fighting men, especially the ones with proper arms, armor, and experience. The men who answered his call were mostly rural Britons who had escaped the initial onslaught, and they carried more easily accessible weaponry like spears, daggers, and javelins. They would have joined the smaller armored and mounted retinue of Aurelius Ambrosius, the man who is sometimes assigned the identity of the legendary King Arthur. His total force was small comparatively, but had the tactical advantage of being elevated on a hill and having marshy wetlands protecting its flank and rear. The opposing Saxons were conversely numerous. 50 years prior, their ancestors migrated to Britania in small and vulnerable groups. The descendants of these people were anything but small and vulnerable now. Their numbers had not only grown with their British conquest, but the freemen known as Chales could now afford better arms and armor. Accompanying them was also a new class of Anglo Saxon, the Thane. This was a man with more power, land, and attendance, and he was especially useful in war when donning his full war regalia. Both Thanes and Chales almost exclusively fought like heavy infantry of the Germanic variety, which usually meant fighting as one dense but mobile unit of overlapping shields, spears, swords, and axes. This is when sources are the most vague. Bede, Gildas, and Nennius all agree that the meeting of the two forces was followed by 3 days of anxious waiting. The position of the Britons was too defensible for the Saxons to attack it directly, due to not only the elevation, but the nearby swamplands, while the Saxon position was too numerous for the Britons to be able to attack and kill. On the third day, we are not told for what reason, but we are told that Aurelius led a charge into the Saxon line. Despite their advantage in men and weapons, the German force shattered upon impact, and a great slaughter was done to the Saxons. Nennius tells us that Arthur killed 960 Saxons in the charge with his own sword. When the remaining Saxons saw some of their finest warriors fall to the ferocious charge of the Britons, they broke ranks and ran from the battlefield. Even if less than 1,000 Saxons died on that day, the impact was massive. The peace that followed lasted for over 44 years, and much of what we know was written during this period by the author Gildas. If we are to believe other authors, Gildas robbed us of much of the details of the Battle of Badon Hill, when he destroyed all of the works praising Aurelius himself after Aurelius killed Gildas's brother Huile for raiding on his territory, as Britons sometimes do. Although enmity persisted between Saxon and Briton, the border between them stagnated. Not only did the Saxons adopt Christianity, which improved relations between the two groups, but political rule fractured on both sides, restricting rulers from the massive armies needed to take the whole region. These factors, combined with the natural geographic barriers on the island, ensured a near-constant border for the following several centuries. The Celtic Britons and Germanic Saxons freely expressed their cultures through art, war, religion, and commerce on their respective sides of Britania.